Words.
There she is.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unexpected Productions Improv Theater in the heart of Seattle's historic Pike Place Market. And of course, our friends and family via live stream on social media. I hope that you found your seats in the main theater and in the comfort of your personal safe spaces.
Okay.
Pride Speaks is presented by Seattle Pride Foundation, and Puget Sound Energy. First and foremost, we at Seattle Pride honor the traditional lands of the Coast Salish and Duwamish peoples, the first peoples of Seattle, named after Chief Seattle. We hope that as we recognize the errors of our past, that we heal through our collective hearts, minds, and actions. And we ask everyone to honor and respect the land that you and your family have come to recognize as your respective homes. If you're just now tuning in, welcome to Pride Speaks, presented by Seattle Pride Foundation, and Puget Sound Energy. It is now my honor to introduce to you the Executive Director of Seattle Pride, Crystal Marks, for the official welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Crystal Marks. I'm the Executive Director of Seattle Pride and the Seattle Out and Proud Foundation. My pronouns are she and they, and it is my honor to welcome you here tonight to our Pride Speaks first ever in-person and live streaming event. Thank you for coming out tonight. The Seattle Out and Proud Foundation that put on this programming is thrilled to keep this free for everyone to attend because we feel that it is an important act of rebellion, of resistance, and of empowerment for our community to talk about each other with each other, to not hear about issues that impact our community from other folks, but to talk about it within our own sphere of influence in our own community. So I really appreciate our speakers tonight. I appreciate those of you tuning in at home and who came out, and we are so glad to continue this Pride Speaks with you that started in the pandemic and is continuing straight on through. It's now my honor to welcome Hayden Harvey from Puget Sound Energy to the stage to say a few words.
Good evening. My name is Hayden Harvey. I'm a community engagement representative at Puget Sound Energy and co-chair of PRISM, PSC's LGBTQ employee resource group. I just wanted to say thank you to the Proud Foundation for creating this space tonight. Like Crystal said, we think it's incredibly important for queer people to hear about things that impact their lives from other queer people, and we couldn't be more proud to support you.
Thanks, Hayden. And now we'll turn it back over to our hostess with the mostest, Alexa Manila. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Seattle Pride Executive Director, Crystal Marks, and Hayden Harvey of Puget Sound Energy, our presenting sponsor for Pride Speaks. Again, thank you, Seattle Pride Foundation, and Puget Sound Energy for creating this forum on a very important subject matter. Pride Speaks is a free quarterly speaker series that focuses on the issues impacting the LGBTQIA+ community, viewed through the LGBTQIA+ lens. Pride Speaks is one part expert speakers, one part question and answer, one part community connections, and 100% awesome. My name is Alexa Manila, and I'm proud to be joining you on this very special event. I use she and they pronouns, and as your MC and moderator, I share from my personal and professional background as a Filipinx American immigrant from the Philippines, and as a licensed social worker, mental health therapist, and addictions counselor. Thank you in advance for allowing me to share my experience and expertise into this dynamic conversation. Also, as you're joining us and listening, please have your questions ready, and Tim Marshall from Seattle Pride we'll be collecting them both from online and in our live studio at Unexpected Productions. We invite you to add your name, your pronoun, and city with your questions. But anonymous submissions are also acceptable if you're the shy type like I am. Now, joining us this evening are three incredible guest expert panelists, starting with Ruth Soto, also known as Latin Rose, she, her pronouns, is a Seattle based singer songwriter whose music is non conforming to the regular Latin styles. She has completed 4 albums, 5 music videos, and has performed from the Nectar Lounge to the Paramount Theater. Please welcome Ruth Soto.
Hi, everyone. Thank you
Our
so much
next
for having me.
speaker is Kins De Vera, he, him pronouns, a multidisciplinary artist and community catalyst living in Seattle, Washington. Outside of his work as a hairstylist, performing as a dancer, and running Seattle Gamers, he spends his free time elevating queer identities and the arts by serving on the boards of Men in Dance, Pride Asia, and as the events committee lead for a young patron circle at the Pacific Northwest Ballet. Please welcome Kins De Vera.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. And sorry about our tech issues right now. I'm sure people are sorting it out.
Please welcome Kins De Vera. Thank you, Kins. And lastly, Dr. Peter Shallett, he, him pronoun, a general physician taking care of the LGBTQIA plus community in Seattle since 1990. He trained in medicine as an out gay man focused on sexual and gender minorities. And that's how it all worked out. He's been in practice for several decades over the years and has had the privilege to be the doctor for many members of Seattle's queer community. Please welcome Dr. Peter Shallett.
I move my hand, and it does this.
Thank you so much. As our guests are getting settled in, I'd like to remind our lovely guests again in the audience, both in our live studio and on social media, that we will be collecting your questions and we will be selecting as many as possible and asking our panelists directly. As we share safe space, both in person and virtual, we recognize that not only is the topic of mental health wellness a sensitive subject, we also recognize it has to be addressed as a community. Through this, we can collectively find ways to heal, and we understand that this may mean hurt and pain. So we ask folks to self-care if moments of triggers and secondary traumas occur. Between a global pandemic with COVID, including the HIV epidemic that continues to affect us, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the war in Palestine, and other countries where many have sought refuge in North America, wars and invasions, including anti-LGBTQ plus legislation like the most recent passing of the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And right in our backyards and front yards, the closure of an iconic and historical organization, Seattle Counseling Service, closing after 53 years. These events, and local and international, have direct and indirect effects on all of our lives as a global community. We hope to at least start these conversations right here and inspire all of us to keep the conversations of healing into our homes and communities even after tonight. To that, thank you in advance. So let's start off with a general question and give us a glimpse of the individual and unique perspectives of our panelists. Although still not as extensive, there is significant data from NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Sage Services and Advocacy for Gay and Lesbian Elders, to Trevor Project, and so on, that support the need to discuss mental health and overall health disparities experienced by the LGBTQ community from your individual perspectives. Kins, Dr. Peter Shallett, and Ruth. Why should we care about this? Why should we even have this forum, for example? Go ahead. Should we care about this? Why should we even have this forum, for example?
Thank you for that question, Alexa.
Go ahead.
I do want to throw it back to you a little bit and say that here in the studio, we're actually getting you twice over, echoing over yourself. And I'm curious if we're getting a little bit of feedback from your computer.
Actually, we're going to let Tim ask some questions right now.
Yeah, we're going to take a break just so that everybody here with us, as well as on our live stream, can hear our conversation, both in real time and virtually. We also just want to thank Alexa for bearing with us, and all of you who are with us for bearing with our technical difficulties. Yeah, I wanted to start off by asking a question for everybody here with us. Alexa has prepared these questions generously, and I want to ask everyone, although we have the data to support the need to discuss mental health, especially the healthcare disparities on the LGBTQ community, from your individual perspective, why should we care about it? Does anyone want to start in? Anyone want to lead that question?
I think it's imperative that we definitely care about it. I know that for myself, it's been huge for me to seek mental health support, and it has helped me through many circumstances in my life. And I think we should care and make it more, normalize it. I think, at least in my culture, it's still a very taboo thing. It's a very taboo topic where we don't talk about this. This is something we hush about, and I feel like us talking about it and normalizing it, like I said, helps people to come out and actually seek that support. And it takes strength to ask for help in any regard.
For sure. I'd like to tack on to that too and say that the way we talk about mental health tends to be very varied. So for instance, I'm a bipolar individual. I live with bipolar disorder. And a lot of times I hear comments like, you know, the weather's so bipolar, or like, you know, oh, she's so bipolar, she was like, you know. And it's actually really interesting because I feel like a lot of times when we talk about mental health, you know, whether it's schizophrenia or like whether it's, you know, depression or anxiety, OCD, a lot of these things, we tend to trivialize it in a way because a lot of times people don't understand what it is. Mm-hmm. And we have these notions of what that means socially. And so I think the best way you can destigmatize a lot of these conditions is to just basically know people who have it, right? Like, I mean, it's like people who didn't know what it meant to be gay or bi or queer or trans until they actually met someone who is that way and is just a normal human being.
Yeah, I can maybe give a medical perspective, but from my point of view, mental health in the LGBTQ community is sort of a doubly stigmatized situation, because mental health in the healthcare community at large is already a stepchild. In other words, we don't have mental health parity as far as coverage for mental health conditions as opposed to other medical conditions. We were supposed to get that with the ACA, but it didn't really happen, and so accessing mental health is hard for everybody in the United States. But then if you look at the LGBTQ community, we are a stigmatized group of people, and our mental health is made more vulnerable by our position in society. I was reading today about anti-LGBTQ and especially anti-trans laws, but also previously laws about marriage and relationships, and they not only stigmatize people and interfere with their ability to live their lives, but they also affect people's mental health. Things like suicide rates go up in places where people are stigmatized because of their gender or their sexuality. And so the LGBTQ community has particular vulnerability in terms of mental health. Also, in terms of accessing mental health, finding providers that are going to be sensitive and accepting and respectful of the person's sexual orientation or their gender identity is also a challenge. Some of the challenge comes from within because people are reluctant to even seek help if they feel that the provider is going to focus on their gender or their sexuality rather than their actual mental health condition. So mental health in the LGBTQ community is huge, and it has its specific needs for our community compared to the community at large.
Yeah, thank you for those perspectives. I mean, within all of your responses, I'm hearing stigma, compounding stigma, depending on a person's background, particularly for folks of color and for all LGBTQIA+ folks in terms of navigating healthcare spheres, in terms of just being able to talk to people about their experiences without it being trivialized or like told that it is non-essential. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I heard that Alexa, our actual host, may be available to ask the next question. So I want to pass it back to her and hear from her for a little bit. Back to you, Alexa. Back to you in the studio. I'm seeing your lips move, Alexa, but I'm not hearing volume. I'm seeing your lips move, Alexa, but I'm not. I hear you now. I still hear an echo. I hear you now. I still hear an echo. Okay, I'm going to ask the next question, and then we're going to continue working to get Alexa back. I wanted to follow up with Dr. Shallett in terms of addressing myths and stigmas about healthcare and how it impacts LGBTQIA+ folks. Considering you are a medical expert and a community member who's really assisted a lot of people dealing with different care concerns, what would you say to members of our LGBTQIA+ community who have struggled finding ways for mental wellness over the years, knowing that you're a primary care physician, but I assume you occasionally talk to people about their mental wellness in the pursuit for care?
Sure. And actually, you know, yeah, I am a primary care physician, which means that I do general care of adults for whatever their condition is. And now there's another echo. I'll talk through the echo. It's people don't realize it, but actually the majority of mental health treatment is provided by primary care physicians. And that goes back to the whole issue of mental health parity, that it's actually easier to find a healthcare provider, a general healthcare provider like a family physician, internist, physician assistant, nurse practitioner, than it is to find and get and pay for a therapist or a psychiatrist or psychologist. So the majority of people access mental health through their primary care providers. So what I would say to the question is probably the easiest way, there's no easy way, but probably the most direct way for someone to access mental health in our community is through their primary care provider, which means first finding a primary care provider, finding one that is at least knowledgeable and supportive of LGBTQ folks, and either working with that provider directly or being referred by that provider for mental health services. And as a primary care provider, I'll just say it's hard to find mental health services, especially now with the pandemic, with everything that people are dealing with. There are lots of therapists around, they're all full, they're all busy, hard to find somebody. And then there's still the issue of therapists that are not sensitive or knowledgeable about LGBTQ people. So, you know, for example, a patient of ours who went to student health. This young woman is transgender, and the therapist at student health continued to misgender her during the first therapy session, which sort of ruined everything. So, and that was not somebody that I referred her to. I have sort of a selected list of people that I know are going to be appropriate for the people I'm referring to them, but it's hard to find. So I would just say, maybe it's my bias as a primary care physician, I would just say go through your primary care physician, which first means finding one, which is a whole other issue. A lot of young queer folks do not have primary, as people get older you sort of have to because things happen, but a lot of young queer folks do not have primary care, which is a whole other issue. As people get older you sort of have to because things happen.
We're still hearing Dr. Shallot over there.
That's the other Dr. Shallot. He's saying everything that I say, but just a few seconds later.
Kind of bouncing off of that, I'm curious in your experience, both Ruth and Kintz, kind of if you have been lucky in finding either a primary care provider or a mental health provider that is affirming both in terms of your experience as a queer person or as an experience as a person of color. I mean, those things I would imagine are both important separately and compoundingly as, you know, a mixture of your unique experience. I'm curious if you have found anyone that is fully affirming in that aspect, and let's start with that.
Well,
and
for
if you have, what tools might you share in terms of how you found that person?
Well, I'm lucky enough to work in health insurance, so I can, sort out the good and, the not so great. And so I was lucky enough to find a PCP provider that is she's amazing. And she's worked with me through my mental health situations, my depression, my anxiety, my severe anxiety at times. And she was awesome enough to refer me to a mental health specialist who definitely guided me through a few dark times in my life, letting go of childhood traumas and all that stuff. So I think that I was just lucky enough to be in the right place to be able to find those resources and those providers. And I also know, Alexa Manila and a lot of folks. So how I would advise somebody to look for a mental health specialist or a PCP is referrals, asking friends, asking family, asking around in the community, because we are going to let you know, hey, yes, I have somebody that I can refer you to. They're amazing. Or don't go to that person because they're not going to be as kind as, I don't want you to go through the experience that I went through. So just ask questions and lean on your peers, your family in the community to help find you somebody.
Thank you.
I've had a different experience. I've primarily been self-employed, and self-employed insurance, for those who don't know, tends to cost an arm and a leg and give you nothing in return. And ironically, during the pandemic, being unemployed, I was able to qualify for Apple Health, which is actually a really fantastic program. So I would recommend anyone who is low on resources to definitely check that out. They only make you requalify every, I believe, 2 or 3 years. So it's been a really big help, because I went from paying, even with just regular healthcare, I went from paying, $360 a month on inhalers to finally having my asthma be taken care of. And there are mental health services through that as well. I will say, though, that knowing how complicated the healthcare industry is in this country, one of the biggest helps has been finding, to your point, being resourceful without necessarily the providers as well is also important. Knowing what you can do in terms of crisis that might not immediately involve healthcare, and then also having the stable base of the healthcare and your primary care. I've had 2 retire on me in the last 8 years. And so, yeah, it's, I would say that, like, in short, I would say check with your network. Normally, the people you can call with your health insurance, if you have it, are pretty good about connecting you to the right resources. You might be in hold for a while, but other than that, if you're able to get access through other means, I would recommend it.
I'm hearing resourcefulness and networks.
Yes.
Yes.
Which to me affirms the idea that unfortunately mental health care, and really just general health care is not, not a given for anyone.
Or it might be like 12 sessions a year.
Yeah,
Right.
I capped amount, right? Capped
You get to the
resources.
parity.
Yeah. I wanted to, so acknowledging that mental health and wellness is not strictly an internal thing. It's a reflection of the world around us and how we sit within our culture, our society, our communities. I wanted to ask a question to Ruth in terms of reflecting your culture as a Latinx American has been, let me re-ask that question. Which aspects of your culture as a Latinx American has been helpful navigating through a dominant white cisgender male society?
I think the best way that I could put it, or the best thing that I could say, is the courage of my community, their resilience, their strength, and I've relied a lot on that throughout maneuvering through this thing called life. And, you know, I was taught my culture by my mother, and she taught me to take space, have a voice, don't back down, be unapologetically yourself, regardless of what anybody thinks, what anybody says. Like, when I came out, not a lot of folks were supportive, and so I had to rely on that strength, that courage, that resilience in me that was passed down by my mother and my culture to get through those moments. So that's how I would, in a nutshell, say that the things in my culture that have helped me maneuver through life.
That's really cool. Thank you. Going off that theme of coming out, I feel like we're just dithering around a little bit.
Sure.
Not dithering, but like going through a bunch of really interesting, rich topics. I'm curious for folks on stage that identify as LGBTQIA, kind of how, let's see, I'm thinking about how I want to ask this question. In terms of coming out, in terms of building relationships with your family and friends, have there been any important choices for you in terms of preserving your mental health and wellness with who you keep relationships with? And would you be willing to talk a little bit about how kind of the concept of like chosen community has helped your mental health? Or if so, I shouldn't have a leading question.
If nobody, okay. When I came out, my parents, my family, they embraced me. My mother, oh my gosh, she's love of my life. The rest of my family was not so kind. My life was threatened, and I was in such a dark space. But thankfully, the stars aligned, the universe aligned, and I shortly after won Pride Idol. And I told myself, I was like, these people that have known me my whole life, stop loving me for something that they shouldn't have stopped loving me for. And now I have this new family that is going to embrace me and love me through all of this, and I'm going to be okay. And I had to cut ties with almost all of my family because unfortunately in my culture, it's still very taboo and they're very religious. And, you know, I'm just thankful for my community because they helped me get through one of the darkest times in my life. So Thank you.
I want to be part of that, I'm sorry. But yeah, I really appreciate your vulnerability when sharing with us your experience.
For sure. Anybody else?
Sure. Coming out is kind of a lifelong experience, and so I'll talk for the next 3 hours about my coming out experience. But actually, yeah, because there's so much to talk about, filter it out. But so I came out when I was 19 in college, and that was like in the 1970s. It wasn't that common. And what happened was I developed a circle of supportive friends, and occasionally I would hear that somebody would say, did you hear what this other person said about you? And you sort of have to just ignore the people that aren't your friends and the people that say nasty things about you rather than, and my whole life now, there's always rumors about me that I always ignore because untrue rumors, if you address them, then it just makes it worse. And then I was an out gay man in Seattle in the 1970s. I moved here for more school. Before I decided to go to medical school, and then I had to go back in the closet for medical school, pretty much. I mean, I was sort of like half in, half out, because, you know, Friday night, my boyfriend and I would go out to the bar and socialize with all these people, and then I'd put on my work drag on Monday or my student drag and go to medical school again. And I was sort of semi-out in the sense that I was out for friends, but not sort of publicly in an in-your-face way. I was about as out as I could be in the 1980s in medical school, because it was still a time when you couldn't get a license to be a physician if you were openly gay. I mean, it's weird because we're so privileged now compared to what things were like back then. But you know, meanwhile, I had a boyfriend, I had a partner all through med school. So, and then it's always been that way a little bit. I mean, when I started medical practice, it was a lot easier because, you know, honestly, my work is like the most gay, LGBTQ, queer job you could ever have. I mean, I spend all day and then I go home and I'm also gay then. So I don't really have any time when I'm not gay or I have to be in the closet. But I'm in a medical community where that's not sort of the norm. And so I don't, you know, call a colleague and say, oh, hi, I'm gay and I have this patient that I'd like to send you. But I do, people know, you know, and people know because I refer them all these queer people, the people that I take care of, so anyway, here I am. But it's always still, I mean, coming out is a lifelong process. It's a totally lifelong process, and people are still either surprised, or if I talk to somebody about my husband, all of a sudden, if I mention my husband, all of a sudden that's like a coming out thing if they don't know me already. So it's kind of a lifelong process. But professionally, I'll just say, as a physician, being gay, it's so much better now, but it was really weird in the 80s and even into the 90s. And then we had AIDS, which complicated things a lot more.
I think it's such a valid point about like coming out is such a lifelong process, and I feel like every queer person knows what it's like to come out over and over again. And regardless of what industry you're in, regardless of like how visible you make yourself, there really is a little bit of that. I mean, I first came out when I was 14, and I ran away from home, which is a whole other story, which we do not have time for. But what I will say is that it really was the first time I started to realize and acknowledge what it meant to have your chosen family, right? I grew up in the Philippines, conservative family, church was literally walking distance. In fact, when I came out and ran away from home, the parish priest was telling my father that I was gay and that was okay, which you can ask me these questions later. But I found myself every weekend spending time with a core group of friends, and every Saturday, like clockwork, there would be a group of us that would see each other. And we are a group of maybe about like 10 to 12 people, and there would be anywhere from 4 to 6 of us, or 8, or 10. And we did that for like 4 years. And then I moved to the United States, and I saw a friend of mine from that same group 14 years later, and it's like nothing had changed. We just picked up where we left off. And I think part of the reason of that is because all queer people have a shared trauma around even if your family loves you, there's a shared trauma around your society, your community not loving all of you. And because there is that, no matter how accepting your family are, or like, no matter how great or not great your immediate circumstances may be, there is an understanding with each other that we've all gone through that. So I think we naturally build a community that way.
Yeah, that's real. I think a lot of people can relate with the idea of building community through trauma as a method of just kind of like persevering, particularly when you have to hide an aspect of yourself, depending on what space that you're in and who you're interacting with. Reflecting on the idea of community for a second and kind of how it has changed in the last couple of years. I'm going to ask the like obligatory COVID question. I'm curious if living through a global pandemic has in any way changed how you approach your community in terms of asking for help or meeting people in different ways. It's really hard to build resources when we're all indoors or kind of unable to be as social as we were. Yeah, and I'm curious if you've found any, if you've gained any tools through the course of the pandemic.
I feel like gaining any tools is a very positive spin.
Yes.
Unlike this, like,
be as honest as you need to be.
And the concept of shared trauma, I think it's wild that we've had so many conversations around COVID-19 and how our lives have changed, how we revalue touch, for instance, as you were saying earlier, and how we continue to reevaluate how we interact with people. And one of the wildest things to me is that we're expected to be as productive as we were pre-pandemic, and that's just unrealistic, right? Like, I mean, pre-pandemic, some of these things are still true, but I had a full-time job. I was running 109 events a year for just one of my orgs. I served on 3, and I was also performing the weekends. And I look back at the person now, and I'm like, I don't know how I did that. And now that my social group is ramping back up to that same number of events, I find myself going, I feel like a fraud right now. I feel like a shell of the version that used to do all of these things effortlessly and have all my ducks in a row, and everything's just a lot more difficult. And I think the biggest tool I would offer to anyone who's tuning in is kind of forgiveness and just allowing yourself to be less productive and less of a superstar than you were pre-pandemic, because quite frankly, we're all still just reflexing those muscles and getting back there.
Great. Yeah, I'm on the same page. Like, things have changed significantly during COVID. You know, the performances got less, my anxiety got higher, being in, you know, on this huge stage. And so I've had to say no to a couple things in the past just because I wouldn't be able to be there mentally, and I possibly may have just had a panic attack on stage, and that's not gonna be good for anybody. So I've definitely had to say no to things, and you know, I sought more mental health support during that time to get me through those dark moments and through that anxiety and through, you know, my self-sabotaging of, you know, don't do that, you shouldn't perform, you shouldn't do that, you're not going to be able to do it. So you know, COVID did definitely impact me negatively in that sense, but I'm slowly getting back into the groove of things because I can't let my anxiety control my life. And that's what I have to keep telling myself. You can do this. You can be on this panel and talk today.
Maybe I can speak a little bit to the professional and then the personal. Something that is negative that's happened with COVID is that social isolation for some people, and having it, I'm owning now that I'm becoming an old person. Okay, so I'm an old person, and I take care of a lot of folks that are my age. In other words, 60s, 70s, 80s, and especially in the LGBTQ community, a lot of folks in that cohort are already kind of isolated. A lot of the men, for example, have lost a lot of their network to AIDS in the 1980s and 90s that they've never reconstructed. So a lot of the people that I see live alone, and the pandemic just sort of worsened their social isolation. And a lot of people are sort of more anxious, more irritable, more unhappy, and that's been really hard. My own personal situation, obviously, it's stressful, it's not fun, it's awful, but the positive part is that my, I guess, chosen family has really thrived in a really kind of odd way. Because, okay, so I have a husband, I also have an ex-partner, and you know, our community needs new words for our relationships. I'm sort of in a three-man relationship, but it's not like three people that are all sort of married to, it's asymmetrical, okay, and I'm kind of the pivot in between. There's my husband and my ex, but we're a family. And what happened in, and we live next door to each other, which helps. What happened in the pandemic is that we made our own little cocoon, kind of, and we started spending every evening together, the three of us, and the man that used to be my partner always cooks dinner. And so for like 2 years, I've eaten dinner every single night with these two men, and it's brought us so close. It's enriched and deepened our relationship. I mean, this is probably maybe the second time in 2 years that I'm not home with my two guys. And
I'm missing dinner right now.
they're actually each taking the night off on their own, but that's another story. But I think about that. It's actually like a blessing that's come out of COVID, that it's sort of pushed us into this family constellation. And I wish there were a word. I don't like the word ex-partner because it's a negative word. I wish there was a word for this other guy besides my husband, who is one of the most important people in my life. Actually, the three of us are all. So that's been a great and kind of a surprising thing that happened to me during the pandemic that I value. And I'm making noise.
That's okay. Yeah, thanks to all of you for sharing. I mean, we know the challenges that came out of the pandemic, and we know that most of us still feel very socially isolated, and that's real. Like, that is something that should not be undermined whatsoever. It is nice to hear how we're thinking about it, you know, not necessarily putting a positive spin, but like, how are we making it through? Like, how are we going to finish the day? It is hard sometimes. Having our routines broken and our community splintered, and just our lives changed, for some more than others, but just like figuring out how we can finish a day, you know, kind of connecting that. I'm curious if there is any particular piece of self-care that you enjoy doing. Yeah, anything. It could be profound or silly, or just what it is, whatever you like to do to take care of yourself.
For me, it was doing music again. I hadn't made an album since 2018, and I just stopped, and I felt myself being unhappier and unhappier. I was happy with all these other things in my life that were beautiful. I got married, and I have a beautiful family, my home. But a piece of me was slowly like withering away and dying, and picking up a pen and piece of paper, because I don't do it on my phone, I do it old school. I write it out. And writing a song, putting my happiness, my hurt, my sadness into that has definitely been something that I had to take up again for me to feel better. And I definitely do. I missed making music, making noise, you know. My mom would sometimes be like, girl, close your door, it's too loud, mija. I'm trying to watch my novelas. And so, you know, just picking it back up, but she saw that it was making me happier, and my husband was like, I'm going to support you through this, and I know that that makes you happy. So he set me up with an engineer that he knew from childhood, and he ended up being right around the corner from my house, and now the 5th album is about to be out April 13th. Let me just put that plug out there.
I want all of you to plug your projects at the end. I promise you definitely should. Yeah.
Thank you. So, you know, picking that pen up and just, that is my self-care, and doing that music, singing it out.
Thank you.
I think, Ruth, I think creating is such a rewarding human activity. I think that's like the most noble thing we do as human beings is make art, create things that are beautiful. And yeah, I think it's wonderful that you could do that. And I think in the pandemic, other people have also found, the people that have survived the best in the pandemic have found a creative outlet. For me, it's gardening, which sounds kind of pedestrian, but it's wonderful. It's my way of being creative.
I wish I could
I don't create beautiful plants, but I nurture them, and it's a reward. And you know, I'm not going out to do things I'm not going to performances and stuff because everybody's like staying home and you can't or you couldn't. But if I'm going to be home, I'm going to be making something, and what I make is growing plants. So that's my thing.
I mean, the fact that I heard about your garden and your plants before I actually got to know you was like,
Hi, I grow plants.
A client of mine basically knows him and just, oh yeah, I know Dr. Peter Shalley, I know all about his plants. So like, I think you're doing good work. To tack actually that last question and this together, I had an epiphany over 2020, and that was, I like to use the analogy of rowing the boat, which is, I found that after the initial trauma of like March 2020, and as we were in kind of the very first phase of it, a lot of my peers with mental health issues or who are open about it, we all had like massive breakdowns. We all like really struggled and suffered. And there was this interesting thing that happened, 2 months later or 3 months later, I want to say, when it started to, at first we were like, it's going to be 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks turned to 3, and then to 2 months, and then to 6. And one of the things I found really fascinating was all of my peers who had, been taking a lot of care of themselves and understanding their anxiety and their depression, and those of my peers who had historically been the ones I know to have suffered the most mentally and emotionally were all of a sudden kind of rowing the boat because there was this realization that societally we were all suffering, and that those of us who had been catering to our needs in that way for years had a skill set and a tool set that a lot of people who hadn't really addressed their mental health had. And while we were all suffering through it, there really was, I think, a shift where a lot of the peers who had struggled were like rowing the boat a little bit harder because they knew the way to do it, and helping some peers who had not really addressed it before. And so to piggyback on one question to another, I would say that the biggest thing for my own self-care has been getting back into building community and making sure those events are as tight as they can be, making sure that people's expectations for what community and gathering means and looks like is consistent, because people are best able to be themselves if they have a framework of expectations around what they're going to experience, and they're more likely to try something new if they know what the new thing is they're going with. And I think that for me, my own personal self-care has come in helping, this is gonna sound so like selfless and whatever, but like has been really in rebuilding community and making sure we have those spaces again, because we really, really need it.
Beautiful.
That's real. Yeah. Thanks to all of you. I think it's probably about 8 o'clock right now. I'm not sure. Awesome. So we're going to start going through finishing. We're done with our scripted questions, and we're going to go into some audience-led questions. Noah, if you can hear me, I would love to be able to see that script where some of those Q&A questions are from our pre-registration. But one that comes to mind immediately that I thought was a really interesting question that's kind of open to interpretation is, what does the term mental health liberation mean to you? Does that strike a chord or mean anything to you in particular? I don't know what it means personally, but I'm curious if it means anything to you.
Just going off of just the phrase itself, for me, what it means is like being okay to talk about it, being normalizing it, having those conversations and having that freedom and having that safe space to bring it up and not have somebody be like, what? You know, or family members be like, we don't talk about that here. That's not something that's real, you know, when it in fact sure as heck is. So that's what that conveys to me. That's what that means to me. It's the first time I've heard it, but I mean, it can mean something else to somebody else.
Yeah. I think it, no, I like the phrase, and I think it identifies a problem we have, which is mental health conditions are stigmatized. And, you know, when we were talking earlier about finding a therapist and people were talking about word of mouth or asking friends, well, personally, if I were suffering from anxiety or depression, I would probably not go to a friend and say, oh, I'm looking for a mental health therapist, I'm having some trouble. I mean, maybe my most intimate, closest friend I would ask, but I'm not going to ask casual friends that. And yet I might, if I had some sort of just medical condition, like, you know, I don't have a PCP, do you have a primary care doc? That's not stigmatizing, but somehow asking about mental health or revealing that you have mental health concerns about yourself is stigmatizing. And also identifying as having a mental health condition, like Kent's talking about being bipolar, or which, by the way, some people would say bipolar condition rather than bipolar disorder, just as a way, again, to destigmatize somebody's situation. We have a very long way to go in terms of mental health being seen as not a moral failing or something that is the person's fault, which is different from a lot of other medical conditions that don't have that same bias about them.
I think that's very valuable, and I think that's also a great segue because, like, quite frankly, mental health and talking about it, and even what we're discovering in it as a science, as a field of study, is all very new. I mean, when I was first diagnosed, I wasn't even bipolar. I had manic depressive psychosis, right? And then all of a sudden, sometimes people would know a little bit more what bipolar disorder was, and they'd ask me, oh, are you type 1 or type 2? And then actually the version I have is one where I experience ultradian cycling, which is considered very, very rare, and it's so rare that even in the mental health community, it's sometimes considered like not a real version of it, which has been a challenge at a lot of and so, you know, a lot of these things are very new still, and the only way we can really, you know, unshackle it is basically by putting faces to the names of things. I mean, if your only version in your head of, you know, what an Asian person is someone who is going to be dressed a certain way and eat a certain thing, and you don't realize that, like, actually, you know, maybe your accent is different than what I would expect it to be. Like, it's in meeting people and meeting types and meeting these labels that we attach to things and finding ways to relate with it on a more human level, I think that we can find that liberation.
Great.
That was great. I mean, that was a term that I had never heard, and I intentionally didn't Google because I was curious what y'all would pull out. But I'm hearing conversation, I'm hearing honesty and authenticity from a person about their experience, and feeling perhaps untethered from the stigma and the silence that comes along with mental health challenges for a lot of people.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. Would anyone here like to raise their hand? I see some cards maybe that I could read. Thank you so much. Okay, this is a great one. Both of these are great. But there's a really good, potentially helpful one, I think. For anybody here who knows anyone who lives with mental health challenges, which is probably 100% of people that you know, what are some signs that we should look out for that tell us that we might need to talk to someone, or someone we know could benefit from talking to someone?
Dr. Shallot.
Thanks. It really depends on what condition you're talking about, because there's a very wide spectrum of mental health conditions. But I think, there's so many. I mean, clues like somebody losing interest in things that they normally would enjoy doing. I mean, I'm thinking about depression, which is one of the very most common mental health conditions that people can have, either temporarily or ongoing, on and off through their lives. But people that lose interest in the things they normally enjoy, people that are particularly, that become irritable, people that withdraw from friends, any kind of change in somebody's social interactions is a red flag. It's hard to get somebody to get help, though. If you recognize changes in somebody, they'll often rebuff you if you say, you know, is there something wrong? Can I help? But it doesn't hurt to still do that. Yeah, I mean, any kind of change in somebody's behavior or attitude. When I see a person, when I see a patient who thinks they may be suffering from depression, one of the things I ask them right off is whether there's something they enjoy doing. And if they get really into, oh yeah, this, you know, I just love doing blah, 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 well, they're probably not seriously depressed. But, you know, there's also degrees of mental health conditions. In other words, you can be seriously depressed. You can also be having a really bad time right now without having a diagnosis of depression, and that doesn't mean seeing a therapist wouldn't help. Mm-hmm. I've been through times like that where I don't think I've been clinically depressed, but I could sure use the help of a third party to help me sort some stuff out. And in that sense, in terms of referring somebody to a therapist, I try to tell people that, you know, the difference between your best friend and a therapist is that you pay the therapist, and you're not laying anything on them because they're sort of a neutral third party, and maybe your best friend isn't like your best therapist, so seeing a professional may be better. The other thing, again, that I see, which is kind of to the question and maybe not, is a lot of times physical symptoms are actually the first sign of a mental health condition. So I can't count how many times somebody's come to see me because of they're having trouble sleeping, or they're like throwing up in the morning. Well, they're throwing up in the morning because they're being bullied at work by somebody because of their sexuality. You know, so physical symptoms can be a sign of actually a mental health condition, and that's something that the primary care provider could pick up as well. But I guess a change in somebody's physical state could also be a clue that they need help of some kind, whether it's a physical illness or mental health condition.
Have either of you had conversations with a friend that you felt that they may have benefited from talking? I mean, that's a little louder, please. Yeah, I wasn't even talking to the mic. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good clinical perspective. And also just as someone who worked with a lot of people, I think about that question, and I think of myself as someone who would be afraid to like talk to a person because I don't want to like infringe on their privacy. But I'm curious if, yeah, I mean, have any of y'all kind of like had an experience where you did end up just like talking to a friend, or maybe you asked for help?
I'd like to hop on that.
Oh.
I think one of the interesting things is when you have your own conditions, it's easier for you to recognize like some of the telltale signs in other people. So there is a certain degree to which I feel like, I actually honestly feel like a lot of people with mental health conditions tend to almost feel a slight responsibility to make sure we look out for our own. But what I can offer on the flip side of that is, if you do know someone who has a condition or is experiencing something, and there are some very interesting things that are more helpful than others, and they're going to vary from person to person. But I think it's subtle little things, but I think one of the best things you can do is make direct asks in which you can help them. So there's a very big difference between saying, call me anytime, and saying, call me when you're in crisis. It's a very different ask because it triggers a different thing in the receiver's brain in terms of, you know, I remember I had an acquaintance I didn't know, I'd maybe interacted with 3 times, who had seen some posts I put on Facebook where I was, you know, talking openly about my condition, and just basically like left me his phone number. He was like 3 blocks away, and all of a sudden the impossible task that night was I couldn't feed myself. And I couldn't feed myself for hours. I had brought home the food. All I had to do was, you know, throw it in a pot. And I sat for like 5 hours. It was like 12:30 or half after midnight. And I remember that this person lived 3 blocks away and had given me their phone number. And I stayed in bed and I just called them and I'm like, I'm so sorry to bother you at this time. Would you come and make me food? It's already ready for you. And so I think that finding the ways in which you can inform someone that you are a resource. So another great ask is, rather than saying, I'm here for you, it means well, but it doesn't actually give the receiver anything. So something that's more direct is like, what can I do to support you? Or what can I take off your plate? Have you eaten today? Is our big ones. When was the last time you slept? And having those direct asks of the receiver can be a much, much better way of supporting them than a vague thing where you're offering something and you want them to know that you're in their camp, but unless you tell them what resource you can offer, it may seem like you're like trying not to intrude, but actually it's less helpful, I would say.
I'm hearing directness
Yes.
is important.
Directness, I mean, you know, give them the autonomy, but also
And consent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
For myself, I will notice just shifts in my mood and my energy, and so I will have those conversations with the closest ones to me, like, hey, I am feeling this way, or I'm feeling a little dark, so if you see me like just zoning out or whatever, no, it has nothing to do with you, I'm not upset with you or anything like that, I am trying to get through this moment, and then I'll write it out, write out what, I'm feeling to try to get through that process. And then ultimately, my biggest thing is communicating with my loved ones. I've never had the conversation where, I've been like, hey, how can I support you? But they have been there, and my husband does a wonderful job, like, what can I do to help you? And that's why when you said it, I was like, That's literally what my husband does. What can I do to help you? What can I do to make your life easier, to get you through this patch that you're going through? And it's a beautiful thing to have that support. That's why I think it's important to, you know, have folks near you or close to you that you can have those vulnerable moments and feel safe and know that you're not being judged, and know that they're in your corner and they're going to be there for you. Because not having that and not asking for help can sometimes get dangerous, you know? So that's my experience with that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that those are all really rich and like awesome perspectives in terms of, I mean, what I would take out of that as someone who sometimes needs help in terms of just like support from a friend or like a reminder to take care of myself is just like trying to build the courage to ask. And it can be hard and scary and just like a big step sometimes when you feel maybe perhaps that you don't deserve the support, or there are other things that one should be doing. But I mean, you can't get support if you don't ask for it.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask one more question. Okay, we have about 10 minutes, 5 minutes? 10 minutes, perfect. So I might have a couple more questions. We've talked about resources a couple times tonight. Kinsey, you mentioned that it is difficult accessing care without having insurance, which makes sense. I'm curious if y'all happen to be aware of any programs or any networks that are helpful towards accessing free or affordable care if somebody wants to go and talk to like a licensed therapist. Like sliding scale free. Apple Care is a great option if you're eligible, if you are a person who qualifies for Medicaid.
You know, it would be very helpful
Yeah.
if more organizations did more, like, you know, we're very grateful to interact with a lot of larger organizations that have these broad networks. And I'm on the board for Pride Asia, for instance, and we have a lot on our website, prideasia.org, we'll have a list of resources for, you know, the AAPI communities for various things. I would say that because there are so many smaller nonprofits, I can't name any of them off the top of my head right now, but because there's so many smaller nonprofits who advocate for a very specific subgroup, that one of the best things you can do is, you know, go to that org and find whom they're connected to directly, because your needs are going to vary. I mean, Entre Hermanos, for instance.
Yeah, that's
you know,
exactly what came to my mind.
That's the same thing,
Yeah.
right, on their website. So I can't give you the name of a direct org or practitioner, but I can tell you that they will often network very directly with communities that offer resource sharing.
Thank you.
I think it's a huge unmet need, honestly.
Yeah.
And I'm very sad about Seattle Counseling Service looking like it's not going to continue, because that was like the answer to your question.
That's what I was going to
know.
suggest at the
Yeah.
end. I didn't realize. Oh, that's awful to hear.
Oh my goodness.
Are their office is closing?
Well, first they said they were closing, and now they said they're trying to figure out a way forward. So we're hoping. But I mean, they're the reason I'm here. Just by the way, as a depressed 20-something-year-old, you know, I went there for counseling, and one event after the other led me to figure out what I really wanted to do with my life and going to med school. And it was because I knew that as a gay man in Seattle, I could call Seattle Counseling Service and get counseling services for free, sliding scale, whatever. I mean, I don't remember paying very much at all. the community needs something like that. If they don't continue, just having a place where any queer person can get care, whatever their ability is to pay. But we don't, without them, we don't have that. So.
As someone who benefited also from Seattle Counseling Services, that is really said here. I mean, I would say that, like so many other things, creates an imperative for us to contact our lawmakers about allocating more funds towards community-centered health programs. Everyone, please do that. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that one, or do we want to do one other question?
I just know folks that I could point
Yeah.
to and be like, they are a great resource that could probably get you connected, or this organization may be able to connect you with mental health support specialists that can maybe have, either it's free or a sliding scale, like you said. So that's all I got.
No, that's good. It's a unfortunately, like, I think it's an increasingly challenging problem as resources get tighter and just like capacity gets tighter for the practitioners that are available that have been working through the pandemic. It is hard to access care, which is what I think, while it is not, it's not like a clinical, it's different. Like finding ways to rely on your community becomes more important than ever.
I will say that one thing I think everyone should know is that the Suicide Prevention Hotline is very good at their job, and they are free. They are a free resource. They will only cater to crisis. But if you have anyone in your life who is struggling or potentially in a place where they might cause self-harm, you should have that number on your phone and speed dial. It's better than calling 911.
Yes.
Thank you. We have one more question. Okay. We're ending on a positive note.
Yay.
I'm going to keep it really open-ended because I want you to answer however this resonates with you. Is there anything that gives you hope right now?
Well, for me, what gives me hope is, right now the thing that's giving me the most hope is my music and just being focused into it, and because it's definitely shifted my energy, shifted my mindset, shifted how I feel inside. So that's giving me hope in regards to my mental health state, that, I'm gonna, be, happier all the time. And my family gives me hope because they are also peace for me. They are my peace. And so those are the things that give me hope.
Thank you.
No matter what we crazy people do, the sun rises every morning, the stars come out at night, the birds sing, and we have all our problems and we despair about everything, but yet no matter what we do, those things keep happening, and that gives me hope. Nature gives me hope. I look and I say, whatever problems I might have, the world continues, and it's a beautiful place, and we should appreciate it.
I'm going to take this into a bit of a mixed bag place, but
Go for it.
honestly, I think the thing that gives us the most hope, me the most hope right now, is to that earlier conversation around shared trauma that queer people have. I think that on a larger scale, societally, we've had that shared trauma for the last 2 years. And in a lot of ways, I'm almost like strike while the iron is hot, and while people understand what it is like to have even a temporary mental health experience, I think there is, we're having this conversation right now, but quite frankly, I think a lot of people who've never had conversations around mental health have had them in the last 2 years. And I think that now is a great time for education, and what gives me hope is, quite frankly, the understanding that a lot of people now, more than ever, know that when you ask someone how they're doing, whether it's the beginning of a staff meeting, that people generally have been answering more truthfully, and I'm just hoping that we can continue to foster that going forward, that personal days become more of a thing. I'm seeing this more happen with more companies. You know, people are allowing people to kind of take time off, no questions asked, or with very few questioning. And basically what I'll say is that I think we are getting to a place where slowly but surely we've taken a bit of a step forward, at least an understanding of its necessity. And I'm hoping that we can use this time right now to make sure that resources start to happen going forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we can't contact our lawmakers, and we can't create resources if we don't talk about them. And I think you're right that that's an awesome first step.
This actually gives me hope. This whole thing is beautiful, and the fact that we are having this conversation, that also gives me hope. As soon as you were talking and saying, I was like, wait, this gives me hope. Like, what? Yeah. So sorry, I had to just throw that in there. This whole thing gives me hope.
Cool. Well, I just want to thank y'all so much for coming out on a Monday night and hanging out with us through technical difficulties and, you know, just whatever else you might be doing tonight. Having our partners make us dinner, for example. Do y'all want to take a second and plug anything? I know you have an album coming out.
I do,
Ruth.
but before I even mention that,
Final words.
Final words for me is, para la comunidad latina, no tengan pena, no tengan miedo de pedir ayuda para su salud mental. Es importante, es vital para ustedes, para nosotros como comunidad. Sigamos adelante y no tengan miedo ni pena, como les digo. Los quiero mucho. In a nutshell, I said to the Latin community to not be afraid or shy or embarrassed to seek mental health support. It's important, it's vital for us as a community. And yeah, my name is Latin Rose as a singer, so you can find me on latinrose.com. I appreciate this moment. Thank you so much, Seattle Pride, for this opportunity. Thank you, Alexa. I know you were only here for a little bit. Thank you, Tim, for being, you know, the hostess with the mostest as well. I appreciate you, and thank you to the panel for having this beautiful conversation with me. Thank you.
Final words. Love each other. You know, we have such this wonderful, diverse queer community, and we're growing, and we need to be each other's allies and just be there for each other. That's it.
Well, I also want to thank the two of you for sharing space with me. I was so looking forward to this, just, you know, having this conversation. And Seattle Pride, obviously, for having us, and Puget Sound Energy for sponsoring this, because these things cost money. Sorry, sad but true. Speak of resources. Final words, I would also just like to say that if you know someone if you have someone in your life struggling with mental health issues, especially if they're transparent about it, never hesitate to talk to them about it. Let them steer the conversation a little bit. But also, I don't think people realize how valuable it can be to build a toolkit around it based off the different people you know and what is and is not helpful to them, and what can and cannot be made available to others when you can recognize patterns or, like, you know, offer assistance and that kind of thing. Please, I am offering that resource as well. I'm very open about my conditions, so feel free to reach out to me anytime via DM. I'm at this little gecko across everything. That's THISLILGECKO, or you can find me at linkedin.com/Kince, KINCE. I look forward to hearing from you and doing this again.
Thank you so much, everybody. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's it. Thanks everybody for who came and for those who checked out our live stream. We appreciate you. Our next event is going to be in this very spot, both in this theater and on these same live stream channels on May 23rd. Check us out and have a great evening.
We did it! Yay! I know.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your patience.
for rising to the occasion.
Yeah, I definitely was planning on leading this one, but it was fun having the conversation. I love conversations like this.
You did great.
Thank you.
Especially for doing the flying.
Yeah.